My father used to tell me, a man's character shows up when he thinks nobody can tell him no. I've carried that with me my whole life, especially on the bench. And one morning, a young man walked into my courtroom and tried to buy his way out of accountability, right in front of everyone. Not with a lawyer's argument, not with remorse, with cash. I've seen arrogance before, but the lesson this case demanded, I wasn't going to rush it. When this case landed on my desk, it didn't look complicated on paper. A moving violation turned into a disorderly conduct charge, and then it snowballed into something much bigger because of attitude. The defendant was 22 years old. The charge started as reckless driving, speeding through a downtown intersection late at night, then rolling right through a crosswalk while pedestrians were stepping off the curb. That's what the police report said. But what caught my attention wasn't just the speed. It was what happened after the stop. The officer wrote that the young man laughed, dismissed the seriousness of it, and told him, "Do you know who my father is?" I've been doing this long enough to know that when someone says that, they're not asking a question. They're making a threat without calling it one. There was also a second detail that concerned me. The officer noted the driver was recording with his phone and narrating the stop like it was entertainment. I read that line twice. I thought to myself, we've reached a point where some people don't experience life unless it's content. No one was hurt that night, thank God. But the potential was there. A crosswalk isn't theoretical. A pedestrian isn't hypothetical. And my responsibility as a judge is to treat near misses like warnings, because next time, somebody might not go home. Here's what happened that night, as best as I could piece it together from the reports, statements, and the footage. The stop took place just after midnight. Downtown streets, weekend traffic, people leaving restaurants, ride shares pulling up, a few late-night workers heading home. According to the officer, the defendant accelerated hard from a red light that had just turned green. Not a gentle roll, a punch of the gas. He hit a speed that didn't belong in that area, and he approached an intersection where pedestrians had the signal. A couple stepped back, startled. One person raised their hands. That's the kind of detail I pay attention to, because it tells me fear was real. The officer stopped him within a few blocks, and the body camera footage showed a young man behind the wheel of a very expensive car, one of those cars that announces itself before it arrives. The officer asked for license and registration. The young man handed it over like he was bored. The officer explained the reason for the stop. The young man smirked and said, "It's a sports car. It's built to go fast." Now I've heard every excuse, but that one always bothers me because it treats public streets like a private playground. So the officer told him calmly that pedestrians had the right of way and he could have seriously injured someone, and that's when the defendant said it, clear as day. "Do you know who my father is?" The officer didn't rise to it. He said, "I don't care who your father is." He started writing the citation, and instead of letting it be handled like an adult, the young man began filming more aggressively, panning the camera, narrating. "Look at this guy. He wants to ruin my night." Then the officer told him to keep his hands visible and stop escalating. The defendant responded, "Relax, I can pay whatever. You guys love money, right?" When I reviewed that line, I felt my stomach tighten. Not because it's the worst thing I've ever heard, but because it reveals a mindset. The mindset that consequences are just prices, that laws are only obstacles for people who can't afford shortcuts. The officer ended up issuing the citation, but the defendant didn't stop there. He stepped out of the car when he was told to stay seated, argued loudly on the sidewalk, and drew a small crowd's attention. That's how the disorderly conduct charge came into play. It wasn't about being rich. It was about being reckless, disruptive, and disrespectful, like the whole world was his stage. As I continued reviewing the evidence, the pattern became clearer. I had the officer's report, the body cam, a short dash cam clip, and a couple witness statements from pedestrians who said they had to step back quickly in the crosswalk. What struck me most was the consistency. People sometimes exaggerate, but when multiple sources describe the same behavior, speed, the crosswalk moment, the verbal arrogance, that tells me we're not dealing with misunderstanding, we're dealing with choice, and the officer's demeanor mattered too. I watched carefully for escalation from law enforcement. I've always believed fairness cuts both ways. The officer remained steady. He didn't insult. He didn't provoke. He gave instructions, explained the law, and tried to de-escalate. The defendant, meanwhile, treated the stop like a negotiation, like the rules were flexible if you had the right last name or the right bank account. I saw the moment where he waved a thick roll of cash, not directly into the officer's face, but in that unmistakable way where the message is, "You want this? Let's make it disappear." The officer immediately told him to put it away, and that was that. But that moment, cash in hand, told me what I needed to prepare for. Because if someone thinks a police stop is purchasable, there's a strong chance he'll think a courtroom is too, and that is a dangerous misunderstanding. In my courtroom, your money may hire you a good lawyer. It may get you a clean suit. It may even get you confidence, but it cannot buy you innocence, and it cannot buy you respect. By the time this case came to my courtroom, it had started bouncing around online. Not nationwide headlines, more like local clips and reposts. My clerk mentioned it to me in passing. "Judge, people are talking about this one. I've never judged cases based on comments. I've never sentenced someone because the internet demanded it. And I've never gone easy on someone because they were connected. The public attention doesn't change my approach. It reminds me to be extra clear, extra fair, and extra careful, because people will form opinions before they hear the whole story. But I will say this, social media has changed the way some defendants carry themselves. They perform, they posture, they treat accountability like a scene they can edit later. And I've seen young people, good young people, make terrible decisions because they want to look fearless online. I don't run my courtroom for the camera. I run it for justice. And justice requires something very simple: truth, responsibility, and respect. When the defendant walked into my courtroom, I noticed two things immediately. First, he walked like he owned the room. Second, he wasn't alone. He had a lawyer beside him, and behind him sat a couple people who looked like they were there to support him or to make sure nothing embarrassed the family. He was dressed well. Expensive suit, expensive watch, hair perfectly styled. But the most important thing he wore was his expression, that half smile people wear when they think consequences are for somebody else. I looked down at the file, then back up at him. I said, "Good morning, Mr. Hale. You understand why you're here?" He said, "Yeah, Your Honor, it's a traffic thing." That answer told me a lot, because it wasn't, "I made a mistake." It wasn't, "I'm sorry." It wasn't even, "I understand it was serious." It was a dismissal, minimizing what could have happened in that crosswalk. I said, "A traffic thing can kill someone. Do you understand that?" He shrugged. Nobody got hurt. I took a breath. I've learned over the years that the first few minutes matter. If you meet arrogance with anger, you get a fight. If you meet arrogance with calm clarity, you sometimes get reflection. I said, "You're right. Nobody got hurt. That's luck. That's not a defense." Then I turned slightly toward the prosecutor and asked for a summary. The prosecutor laid out the reckless driving allegation and the disorderly conduct from the sidewalk argument. We then played a portion of the body cam footage in open court. When the video showed the crosswalk moment, the courtroom got quiet. You could feel people leaning forward. And I watched the defendant while it played, because I learned more from faces than from words. He looked away, not ashamed, more like annoyed. Then came the audio. "Do you know who my father is?" And then, "Relax, I can pay whatever." I paused the video. I looked directly at him and said, "Mr. Hale, I want to give you a chance to explain yourself. Why did you say that?" He leaned into the microphone like he was doing me a favor. It was just talk. People say things when they're frustrated. I nodded slowly. People do say things, and what they say reveals what they believe. His lawyer jumped in, very professional, and said, "Your Honor, my client understands he could have handled the interaction better." I held up my hand politely. "Counsel, I'll hear you in a moment." Again, I want to hear from him. Then I asked, Mr. Hale, do you believe laws apply guarantly to you? He laughed, actually laughed softly like the question was cute. He said, no, Judge, come on. I kept my voice even. I said, let me tell you something. In my courtroom, come on is not an answer. Do you believe your money changes the rules? He paused. His eyes flicked toward his lawyer. Then he said, money solves problems. That's reality. That sentence hit the room like a cold draft because it was honest and it was ugly. I said, money can solve some problems, but it can also create others if it teaches you you're above people. Then the moment happened, the one people later talked about. While the prosecutor was speaking about recommended conditions, driver safety course, fines, a short suspension, the defendant reached into his pocket. He pulled out a thick roll of cash and held it up, and he said, how much is this going to cost? Because I've got it right here. Can we just handle it? For a second, the courtroom didn't even breathe. My bailiff took one step forward, not aggressively, just ready. The prosecutor stared. The defense attorney looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't bang anything. I just looked at him, long and steady. I said, put that away. He hesitated, like he couldn't believe I meant it. I said again, Mr. Hale, put it away, now. He did, slowly. And when he finished, I leaned forward slightly. I said, do you know what you just did? He said, I was just trying to pay. I cut him off gently but firmly. You were trying to buy your way out, and you were willing to disrespect this court to do it. Then my bailiff approached the bench quietly and handed me a printed page. My clerk had given it to him. I glanced down, and I felt that familiar disappointment settle in my chest. It was a screenshot, a social media post from that morning. The defendant had posted a short video, apparently from the hallway outside the courtroom, with the caption, about to see this dramatic judge. Wish me luck. LOL. I looked at it, then I looked up at him. I said, Mr. Hale, did you post this today? He blinked. I don't know. Maybe. My friend runs my account. I said, I'm going to ask you again. Did you post it today? He sighed. Yeah. I nodded. So you came into court, accused a judge of being dramatic, and then tried to pay with cash like we were at a restaurant. I let that sit. Then I said something I've said many times, but I meant it deeply in that moment. I don't punish people because I'm offended. I correct behavior because society depends on it. He shifted uncomfortably. The confidence started cracking. Not fully, but enough for the truth to get in. I turned to the prosecutor. Is there any indication of prior offenses? The prosecutor said, one prior speeding ticket, Your Honor. Nothing violent. I turned back to him. I said, Mr. Hale, I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to stop you from becoming the kind of man who hurts someone and thinks he can write a check to erase it. His lawyer finally spoke again, and I listened. He argued that the defendant was young, privileged, and immature, not malicious. He offered that his client would accept conditions, perform community service, attend a driver safety program, and pay fines. Then I asked the defendant one last question. I said, Mr. Hale, do you have anything to say to the people in that crosswalk who had to jump back because of you? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he said, I'm sorry they got scared. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first sentence that resembled accountability. I said, that's a start. I've been on this bench long enough to know the difference between a bad person and a young person making bad decisions. But I also know this. If arrogance isn't challenged early, it grows teeth. I looked at him and said, Mr. Hale, I want you to understand something. I paused, because pauses matter. They force people to listen. I said, respect isn't something you give when it's convenient. Respect is what you owe because you live among other human beings. Then I addressed the social media part directly. I said, you posted that I'm dramatic. Let me tell you what's not dramatic. A pedestrian getting struck in a crosswalk. A mother getting a phone call that her child isn't coming home. That's real life. That's not a post. That's not content. I took a breath and continued. I said, this sentence isn't about your father's money. It's about your future. Because right now, You're headed toward a moment where luck runs out. Then I explained my decision clearly. I said, here's what I'm ordering. First, I imposed a significant fine consistent with the charge. Nothing outrageous, nothing symbolic. Real consequences within the normal range. Second, I ordered him into a certified driver safety program and required proof of completion. Could just ride off. And I told him exactly why. I said, I want you to spend time serving people who don't have what you have. Not to shame you, to educate you. Because humility is learned faster when you're not the center of the world. Fourth, I set a period of probation with strict conditions. No further violations, no harassment of the officer, and no social media posts about the case during the term. And then I looked at him and said one of the most important moral truths I know. You had choices. You made poor ones. Accountability is how you earn the right to make better ones. Finally, I said, if you complete every condition, I will consider reducing this to a lesser offense at the appropriate time. But you have to earn that. You don't buy it. After I delivered the sentence, the courtroom felt different. The air was lighter, not because anyone was happy, but because the truth had been spoken plainly. The defendant stood there quietly. The money, the swagger, the performative confidence, none of it helped him. And for the first time that morning, he looked his age, young, unsteady, human. His lawyer thanked the court. The prosecutor nodded. We moved on, because that's what courts do. The next file always waits, but that case stayed with me after the docket ended. I spoke to my staff briefly and said, this is why we do what we do, not to humiliate, to teach. Later, I heard that the clip of him holding cash had made its rounds online. People argued in comment sections like they always do. Some wanted me to lock him up. Others thought he should walk free because it's just speeding. But I don't sentence for applause, and I don't sentence to trend. I sentence to protect the public and to guide someone back toward decency when there's still time. And in this case, I believe there was still time. Let me tell you what I hope people learn from this. Money is useful, but it's not a moral shield. It can't buy you integrity. It can't buy you maturity. And it certainly can't buy you permission to endanger strangers. Social media makes it easy to mock consequences, easy to turn serious moments into jokes. But real life doesn't care about your caption. Real life doesn't care about your followers. In my courtroom, I try to remember this. Every defendant is a person, not a headline. And every victim or potential victim is somebody's whole world. So if you're watching this, remember, respect isn't optional. Accountability isn't negotiable. And the best time to learn humility is before you hurt someone who can't afford your mistakes. That's what justice means to me.